Welcome to Linden World! 5 years ago we had a rudimentary version of Second Life running which was called Linden World at the time. Our avatar was affectionately called Primitar. Notice that his arms and legs are made entirely of primitives. We couldn't render anything other than a primitive and a few special objects in those days. Notice at my feet a rock. Our walk animation was somewhat less sophisticated than it is today. You can see in the distance various buildings. These were auto-generated by the server side. They weren't actually constructed by anyone. You can also see various objects that I threw into the display just for illustrative purposes. We had mouse look then, but we were very gun-focused. So every avatar in the system had a gun. You had energy. You could throw grenades. Notice that the only way to terraform is to drop grenades on the land. We spent a lot of time dropping grenades on the land to terraform. Grenades could also interact with physical objects. Andrew spent a lot of time getting objects to fracture in an interesting way. You'll see the objects bouncing on the ground. That's an effect called popcorn that we did to test the physics engine. Any object on the ground would be thrown up into the air every second or so. In the distance you can see trees, some rudimentary roads that were created with primitives. Even then, everyone could fly. Notice the little blue jet animation, although our flying animations and sort of buoyancy effects were less efficient then, or less interesting then than they are now. This is a close-up of one of Philip's buildings. This was when we were trying to decide if Second Life was going to be primarily an open natural landscape or a more city-like space. We did then have the shout animation. That was me saying hello. At the time we had a very different approach to natural life. These are the trees at the time, which are actually fairly similar to the trees now. However, we didn't do any level of detail reduction. We also had water simulation in those days, which we had to eliminate because it was too computation and bandwidth intensive to transmit. You can see the surface of the water bubbling up and down as I drop grenades into it. You can also see the terrain underneath it being modified. That little thing jumping away there is a bird. We'll look at those again later. We had lots of excitement with the water. It would plink slightly when you shot it. It would bounce more when you dropped grenades into it. I'm just going to blow up this bridge so that we can see the water bounce a little bit better. The land there is at exactly the same height as the top of the water, so you're seeing some Z fighting. One other exciting part of the water was that if you dropped enough grenades into it, you could make it go unstable, so there would be waves jumping up to hundreds of meters in the air. We allowed you to move the sun then as now, and we had a flashlight, a very simple OpenGL lighting effect. So we would run around with the flashlight and light things. People who are extraordinarily interested in lighting will notice that our boxes light horribly because there's, well, problems with the number of vertices we were generating and the normals. That is an Ator. An Ator is kind of like a snake, but actually it's an Ator, perhaps derived from an alligator. These Ators, well, sorry, that's how you created objects in those days. You would spawn them in front of you. Those chirping things are birds. So we had a very primitive ecosystem. The Ators would run around and eat the birds. When the Ators ate the birds, they would get bigger. Birds, of course, lived on rocks. That little Ator there must have just been born. If Ator managed to accumulate enough energy by eating birds, it would reproduce and spawn smaller Ators, which would then eat birds and get bigger. And, of course, you could control the population with your handy gun. Let's see if this little guy gets any bigger. I'm dropping some more birds in hopes that he'll eat one. Unfortunately, the birds are quite rapid, so it's difficult for little Ators to go catch them. Go, Ator! Go, Ator! Did he get one? Nah, the birds are too fast for him. We had clouds then as now, although I think our current cloud sprites look a little bit better. Wireframe looks very similar today as it did then. Again, I think we're spending a little more on the sky these days. We had no attachments at that time. And now it's raining. We had a simulation of wind and cloud density, which we actually still have in Second Life, but at points where cloud density got too high, we would generate this rain effect. And you can see the rain sort of streaming towards us as we fly. Again, rain had to be eliminated because we had no way to detect whether you were indoors and the object inside would occlude the rain. This version of Linden World had a very rudimentary texturing system. In this case, I just changed the texture to a Mondrian painting, I believe. At that point, we did have JPEG 2000 compression, and I believe we would download the entire image before we displayed it. We didn't have any sort of progressive image streaming at that point. But we did have high-resolution images, and they looked pretty good. From there, we had a lot of work to do. We needed more realistic avatars, better walking. But at the time, it was fun to just drop grenades on buildings and watch them fragment into many, many pieces, and watch them bounce up and down on the floor. This is something we've lost in the latest version of Second Life, but I think the world is still a much better place than it was in August of 2001. And that's where we were. Yes, Philip wrote code in those days. Andrew's still working on Havoc 2. User interface such as it was. At the time, all the UI was Windows-specific controls that didn't pick up in this animation. And thanks to Tessa for keeping us fueled with caffeine and dealing with vendors. Bye all.